Anyway, between 1200 and 1500, there's something else that often gets overlooked, and that's the rise of modern cartography. What is cartography? Cartography is a simple word, map making. So maps were new. You can go back to the ancient Roman days, even the Babylonian days. Thousands of years ago, people attempted to make maps. How accurate were they? Not that accurate, right? So what we see is the rise of modern cartography and accurate maps so that people can use them to navigate around the world. And that's a huge thing. We're going to talk about that later. That's a part of this course, a discussion forum, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so the late 1400s to 1500s, we see the beginnings of science, the rise of science and scientific methods. Okay, and that's going to make a huge difference. The modern world is in many ways sits on this modern scientific methods and approaches to learning. That now, interestingly, in 1492 in Spain, we see really almost the end of the Crusades, because in Spain, the Crusades had continued for 700 years as the Spanish Christians sought to drive out the Muslims out of Spain. And in 1492, they successfully did that, right? And so they drove them into North Africa. And so Spain, they got rid of a lot of Jews and a lot of Muslims out of Spain in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed, right? Now, in 1492, Columbus, of course, leaves in October. It takes several months to get across, and he stumbles into this new world. Unbeknownst to him, it's a new world. He thinks he's in Asia, right? He stumbles into this new world, and this is a game changer. Humanity's never going to be the same after that, right? In 1497, a Portuguese man, was Vasco da Gama, and he reached India for the Portuguese, and sailed all the way around the tip of the south of Africa and into the Indian Ocean. And again, he made an end run around the Muslims in North Africa and the Middle East. And so that was a huge event for people living in Europe. It's going to lower the cost of all those trade goods. It's going to make a lot of people very, very rich. Now, there's another item, and that is the ideas of the solar system. The sun is actually the center of the solar system, not the Earth. And so those are some of the big changes that happened in the minds of people in Western Europe at that time, events that helped lead up to the modern age. And now we're going to talk about the coming of the modern age. Throughout the long period of the Middle Ages, Western Europe was developing into a vibrant and powerful part of the world. What would come to be called today, we call it Western civilization. On the eve of Columbus's great discovery of the New World, that greatness was not immediately recognizable. In 1492, the most powerful, the greatest country in the world was not Western Europe, it was China. China had wealth, power, technology, enough to explore, discover, and exploit the world in the way that the Europeans would do later. But they didn't seem to have the temperament or the desire. For the Chinese, they felt as if they had everything they needed at home. So it fell instead to the maritime states of Western Europe to do that. For better or worse, Western Europe would come to create the modern age and the modern world. It was going to be their vigorous and aggressive spirit that would come to dominate and ultimately change the planet for 500 years. So why should Europe have become the most powerful part of the world? Why should Europe and the West, instead of China and the Arabs or the peoples of India, come to explore, exploit, and dominate the planet for 500 years? To answer that difficult question, one must look first to geography and the cultures and the histories of the people of Europe, Eurasia, and Africa. Geography explains a lot. If you look closely at the map of Europe, you will see how Western Europe juts out into the Atlantic Ocean. The distance between China and Western Europe was enormous and separated by mountain chains and deserts. So, so China was never going to be able to control Western Europe. There was no one single great power after the Roman Empire that was able to unify Western Europe. So we saw the continuing period of smaller states emerging slowly and competing with one another. But look closely again. See how Western Europe juts out into the Atlantic. The Mediterranean lies to the south, and that separates them from Africa. But they're still connected to the Middle East. So the flow of ideas and people could happen and did. Ideas as well. The Mediterranean was both a barrier and a pathway, kind of an insulation from Africa. We call the western states of Europe maritime states because they all border on the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. These are states that are border on the sea. Due to their access to the sea, it was natural for them to develop a sea trade and to be oriented toward the ocean. In addition, because of feudalism, Europe didn't develop into one single overpowering state. No second Rome came into existence to dominate and control everything. What did happen was that, as I said previously, many smaller competing states developed, each with their own languages and cultures and traditions. Almost every country in Europe was really, like you take French, for example. French was made up of many, many dialects, right? Today we think of French in one kind of spoken French, but France was made up of many dialects, some of which those dialects were really, so different you couldn't understand them from one place to the other. And the same was true of almost all countries in Europe. So anyway, these European states were competitive and often at war with each other. Eventually, as more powerful nations came into existence, the old feudal system declined. These countries tended to compete more intensely for land and resources. So the discovery of new lands meant more wealth and more competition and more conflict between these states as they emerged. States like France, Spain, England sought control of the New World. It brought tremendous wealth back into those countries. They were able to build bigger navies, have bigger armies. And so, as we see nation states emerged out of the old feudal order, like Spain and Portugal and France and England, these states were very, very strong and centrally controlled by powerful monarchs, right? So, again, the discovery of those new lands meant more wealth, more competition, more conflict. And France, Spain, England sought control of the New World. And we'll see later on in American history, that's exactly what we have. We have Spain and France and England all competing for control of North America. It's going to be a very important feature of American history. For better or for worse, these struggles came to dominate the European story for 5 centuries. That's a long time. So, regardless, it was Europe who taught the world to know itself. It was Europe's exploration and exploitation of the planet that brought on the modern age and introduced the rest of the world to the modern age. It began a new and unparalleled chapter in human history. The human story takes an extreme turn with the introduction of the modern age and the discovery of the New World. The world discovers itself, and Europe is at the heart of that. So we say today there's such a thing as Eurocentrism. That is, we like to tell the story from the European standpoint. And yet, you can't get around the fact that Europe was the focus of all of this activity, science, learning, exploration, and along with that came domination of peoples, exploitation of peoples, often cruel and a bitter pill for many people. So the next thing we'll look at is just how do all of this fit together? How do we fit into this story? And I mean United States history. When we look to understand our story and our national character, we see we cannot isolate ourselves from the greater story of Western civilization. We're still living and creating it. however fairly or unfairly, Western Europe, Western civilization, and by extension, the United States, has led to the rise of a new kind of world, both amazing, wonderful, and often frightening and sometimes horrifying. A long time ago, there was a sports announcer. His name was Jim McKay, and he said once, our greatest hopes and our worst fears are seldom realized. And I think it can be fairly said that when it comes to the history of Western civilization and the United States, and its impact on the wider world, that's kind of how it's been. Our greatest humans, the greatest hopes and worst fears at times have been realized. Of course, our job in this course is to pick up the story at the start of the Middle Ages, when Christopher Columbus stumbled onto a new and unknown world. He opened a new chapter in human history. His discovery, along with those of the Portuguese, would allow Europe to break out of its medieval isolation and project its people, cultures, and systems of government and religion far beyond its shores. Some 150 years after Columbus first landed in America, the English began their story of discovery and colonization. And here our story begins in the modern state of Virginia, in the southern part of the Chesapeake Bay, Roanoke, and later Jamestown. It must be understood that between the first English colonial settlements and the Declaration of Independence some 169 years later, the seminal period saw the growth and development of 13 unique English colonies. These small colonies were truly the offspring of Great Britain. And as it turned out, they were 13 different experiments in self-governance and government, reflecting the current and ancient history of England. Great events were happening in England as its colonies were founded and grew. The politics, religion, wars, and civil wars of that small island helped shape the nature and character of each colony. Okay. Clearly, and it's strange that many people today don't understand that we here in the United States owe our language, our common language, to England, to Great Britain. We owe much of our political institutions to England and Great Britain. It's shocking to know that many Americans don't even know where England is today. These are the kinds of things that we're going to explore, we're going to look at very closely as we move along, just exactly what was going on in England at that time, how did it impact the story of colonial development, and later on the birth of the United States. Americans today, whether we realize it or not, we are part of a much older, a longer tradition that reaches back all the way to the time of Rome and Greece. Those ideas of democracy have floated through history and come down to us today. So anyway, thank you for listening, and we'll be moving into the course. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.